your ideas around the World Trading System Code of Conduct and whatever else you want to say. And then, we can have a conversation or just open it up to questions from the audience.
Right.
So before we start, can you, let me see if I put this on. Can you guys see the screen, the webinar?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Okay, yeah, so let's get started. So, I'm going to just briefly make some overview, and then Dan is going to make some welcome remarks. So let's begin with this. So after with Dan's welcome remarks, and this is my apologies, this is Dr. Dan Koo, our CEO, and then I'm going to make some introduction and an overview from Ed, who is the Vice President of International Trade at CTA. And then we have the main feature presentation from Alan Wolf, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And we're going to have some questions and answers afterwards that. And let's get going. So just first, some house rules. This webinar will be recorded. Kindly mute your mic when you're not speaking and be respectful. We won't be addressing, off-topic questions regarding politics, religion, hate speech, personal rants, and so on. Appreciate your cooperation. Dan, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Alan, Ed, and all others for being a part of this webinar. This is an important question that we're faced with today. Whether global trade systems, or perhaps it is we are welcoming the new world order, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of many other geopolitics as well. So I think we have with us today a speaker who is innately qualified to address this thorny topic and issue, Alan Wolf from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We're very happy and honored for you to have you join us today. So, and we look forward to the discourse that will follow. This indeed is one of the key topics, priorities for which this year, being global tech trade in particular as part of the overall trade environment, the other being AI futures. Are we going to face more of a dystopian AI future or an utopian one? So I think on that note, I welcome everyone and thank you for your presence today. Back to you, Anders.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ed Birdswell, Vice President of International Trade at the Consumer Technology Association. He is also the chairman of WITSA Policy Committee. So Ed, really appreciate you being in here and to make some introductions for this webinar.
Well, thank you, Anders. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Alan Wolf today. Alan and I go way back, and we both have a connection to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, where I attended graduate school. So, Alan is a luminary in the trade policy field, and I think everyone on this webinar today and whoever views it in the future is going to learn a tremendous amount from Alan. And he is a prolific writer as well in his role as a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. But I think just as a preface, we're witnessing, as Dan witnessed, some major shocks to the international trading system, mainly because of the Trump 2.0 administration's initial rounds of tariffs using new authorities that have never been used before, like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is and then today, this week we saw revived tariffs on steel and aluminum, more expanded tariffs on steel and aluminum, actually, and retaliation by U.S. trading partners, Canada, European Union in particular, tariffs on Canada and Mexico separately under IEEPA. So there's more to come on April 2nd. The administration is saying that they want to impose a new system of reciprocal tariffs and sectoral tariffs across every single U.S. trading partner, major sectors of the U.S. economy, including semiconductors. So this is a time of great disruption and tumultuousness. And we know at CTA that there will be consequences, some of which are intended, some of which are unintended. And this has become our top priority, policy priority for the Consumer Technology Association, everything to do with tariffs and trade in 2025. So we know what the United States is doing, but the question is, what are other countries doing, and how's the system as embodied by the World Trade Organization responding? Uh, this debate is now, in the hands of governments around the world in terms of their responses to the Trump administration and how they use the WTO in their responses. So in today's webinar, Alan Wolf, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics here in Washington, D.C., will explain why WTO members should meet as soon as possible this year and adopt a World Trading System Code of Conduct 2025. This is a very innovative new idea from Alan. And the goal Alan is articulating is that the participation rate in this code of conduct should be as high as possible. So perhaps this generation of the rest of the world's trade officials, stimulated by U.S. trade policy, can think through of how to achieve enhanced degree of cooperation with their country's trading partners. And the WTO should be the place for convening all these conversations. Just a little bit more about Alan. Before joining the Peterson Institute in 2021, he was a Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and I got the pleasure of meeting Alan in Geneva a few times during his tenure there. And his research today focuses on developing reforms of the WTO, responding to the role of the United States, the European Union, and China in the international trading system, and serving the needs of all countries in using trade to achieve economic prosperity. During his visiting fellowship at the Peterson Institute, along with numerous papers and essays, Alan has written a book on the future of the trading system entitled Revitalizing the World Trading System. And it was selected by the Financial Times as one of the best books of 2023 in economics. So with that overview, Alan, it's my pleasure to turn the microphone, so to speak, over to you.
Very good. Good to be with you all today. A lot is happening in the front of on trade policy, on tariffs. Perhaps the way the screen should operate is to have that slide off, and if possible, and just we see each other as we speak. What I was writing was a month ago was what all the other countries in the world should do if the United States is choosing to go its separate way with respect to trade. The issue that Mr. Trump has put on the table is reciprocity, reciprocal. Are we getting reciprocal access from other countries from a U.S. point of view? The whole program of trade negotiations began in 1934 with Franklin Roosevelt. There had been the highest tariffs ever in 1930, Smoot-Hawley, and in 1934, Roosevelt asked the Congress for authority to negotiate tariffs down on a reciprocal basis. So it's called the Reciprocal Trade Negotiations Act of 1934. My involvement in trade negotiations began in the 1970s, and there was the Tokyo round of trade negotiations, named because after Tokyo, because that's where it began. George Shultz, Secretary of Treasury, kicked it off, and the effort was to get the world's trade freed up further. There were 8 rounds of negotiations under the auspices of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. And so what was GATT all about? contractually bound tariffs, non-discrimination, treat everyone the same. Each country treating all others the same. Get rid of quantitative restrictions. Limit export subsidies, and have peer review. You come in to a discussion, not a litigation, a discussion of your trade policy, and you tell the other countries, the other members of the WTO, what you've been doing. They review their perspectives of what is happening, and it's an open system with complete transparency to the extent possible. So that's the system, and the United States has decided that that is not acceptable. The tariffs that come into effect, or at least announced to come into effect sometime in April, after April 1st, may come. Trump has been very prompt about delivering on his promises, so one expects additional tariffs against all comers, perhaps all trade on April 2nd. And he reiterates continually that that's what's going to take place. This differs from steel and aluminum. Steel and aluminum, steel has been an issue that's been around for decades, and a lot of litigation, a lot of import restrictions put on by various countries, not just the United States. And it used to be you didn't like it, you complain about it in the WTO, you go to dispute settlement, you get a right to retaliate if the U.S. or any other defendant doesn't remove the tariff or adjust it to your satisfaction. That went away with the EU retaliation, Canadian retaliation during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, whereas the European Union said, well, what you've really done is removed a right we have to respond. So we think you took a safeguard action. But what's happening now is far broader than that, and that's the April series of events, sort of presaged by the 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico, which have been modified. So what should the other countries do? The there is no coherent response. There's no uniform response. There's nothing in the WTO rule book, in the GATT, that says what it is that should take place at a time like this, when one of the major trading countries in the world decides that it will simply free itself of its tariff obligations and all other obligations to the extent they wish to. And what's taking place in Geneva now? There was at Davos in January, and that was in the first couple of days of the Trump administration, but Trump had foretold what was going to take place. A meeting of ministers, sort of a mini ministerial, and they talked about trade issues as if the United States hadn't announced anything, as if Trump didn't have a different trade policy. So there was no coherent response of those ministers who were present, and ambassadors, WTO ambassadors, in Davos around the 25th or so of January. Well, a couple of weeks later, there was a General Council meeting. General Council is a meeting of all at the ambassadorial level in Geneva. All the representatives of all the countries are welcome, 166 of them, in a room to discuss current events or whatever is on the agenda. And again, they mainly talked as if the world hadn't changed. So no coherent response. So the article I wrote, which I think has been circulated to you, or at least a link has been circulated, is what should all the other countries do? I'm not saying what they should do with respect to um, the United States directly. What should they do with respect to each other? Uh, for example, if there was a negotiation between which there will be, between the European Union and um, the United States, and the EU says in April of this year, well, they foretold this, so we know it. Uh, why don't we lower our tariff on cars, automobiles, to 2.5%, the same as yours? We'll match your tariff. Our tariff is currently 10%, they would say, and we'll go to 2.5%. Well, they're going to do it on a most favored nation basis. In other words, apply the 2.5% to everyone, all countries, including China, which is a major issue for them in competitiveness right now in the automotive sector. Or are they going to, which would be uh, um, what their obligation is under the WTO is to do it on a most favored nation basis, or are they going to do it bilaterally? We give you, the United States, 2.5%. We don't have a free trade agreement with you. In fact, we don't have much of any agreement with you on trade other than the WTO. And we'll give you this special benefit, and they don't give it to others. Well, that's one possibility, which is the most likely, that something will be done just for the United States if there is a negotiation at all. Um, so, what what should uh, the countries that are members of the WTO, the trading partners, do, in my view, is have a code of conduct among themselves that says, number one, we're going to the extent possible, maintain the current rules-based world trading system and as it's administered by the WTO. Among ourselves, if the United States chooses to be on the outside, not want to do it, that's okay. It's really not okay, but we can't control the United States. But we can't control ourselves. We can control our own behavior. So 165 of us say we're going to pledge that we're going, to the extent possible, maintain the current system, and we're going to make it better by allowing those of us who want to move forward with an agreement. Um, let's say during COVID, uh, the WTO could have had an agreement of those who were willing to that didn't bind all countries, but only those who wanted to do it, to say we will not block trade in essential goods, masks, medical equipment. Uh, uh, some of us are going to agree to that, and a few did, but they did. It wasn't very broad. Um, Singapore and New Zealand, Australia, a few pledged to remain open. Canada led many countries in the pledge of not interfering with food shipments during the pandemic. Well, strengthen the existing system to the extent one can by having plurilateral agreements, meaning more than not everyone, but all those who wish to join can. Um, and this would cure a major problem in the WTO today, where they can't reach new agreements. Number three, um, seek to avoid any bilateral arrangements having a substantial adverse effect on others. Um, uh, Clearly, there are bilateral agreements that could be put into place that would adversely affect non-participants. So try to avoid doing that. Um, the if there's any rerouting of trade flows, minimize injury to other economies. Well, what does that mean? The United States is in the process of blocking imports with high tariffs, an additional 20% already, on top of the 20% or so effective tariff rate left over from the first Trump administration. Um, it wasn't for all products, but it was for a lot of, let's say, 2/3 or 3/4 of China trade. Um, uh, for this, so an effective 40% tariff rate in the United States on Chinese goods. Um, if China decided to reroute the exports it couldn't ship to the United States to Europe, there would be a reaction. There has been a reaction. The U.S. is not taking any electric vehicles, EVs, from China's 100% tariff or more. And Trump has said he'd go to 200%. He said at one point. Um, and so, what's the reaction? The EU has imposed its own countervailing countervailing duties, anti-subsidy duties. But that's just EVs. What about everything else? The EU is going to be under some pressure domestically to react against a change in trade flows. And China has to think about that, as well as the EU. Among themselves, they should abide by dispute settlement. There's an alternative dispute settlement arrangement, which the EU invented, and China and Canada, the Commonwealth countries, a number of others, Japan, have signed on. So a lot of world trade is still under binding dispute settlement. The U.S. Got out of binding dispute settlement by killing off the appellate body, by blocking appointments to on the body that would hear any appeals. Um, the There are a number of other changes to the rules that would be useful with respect to dispute settlement. We can go into that later, but it's sort of a side issue. Making things better is a side issue right now. Holding things together is the main issue. And I would do a number of things of allowing the Director General to take some leadership role. Who ever heard of any organization that you have a CEO, I noticed, because he spoke at the beginning. What organization of any sort doesn't have a chief executive? WTO doesn't really. It doesn't want to hear proposals from the Director General. It doesn't want to have the Director General setting the agenda. This differs from all other organizations, including the World Bank. The president of the World Bank makes proposals as to how the World Bank's funds should be used. It's not binding on the members, but it's a voice that is heard. The managing director of the IMF, the Secretary General of the OECD, every organization, international, multilateral, even a township, has an executive. WTO doesn't, which is rather remarkable. And in these perilous times, this should be a real executive. And that can just happen overnight. The Director General speaks up, and the members applaud that there's some leadership beyond the what exists today. Talking about important things at the WTO. I mean, fisheries subsidies limits, it's not unimportant. The world's fisheries are being overfished. But is that an answer to today's problems? Is that an answer to food security, food insecurity? Is that an answer to future pandemics? Is that an answer to climate change, to the needs of the world in terms of trade? So the organization has sort of failed to seize the moment. And when I say the organization, there's no WTO. There is, for most purposes, a group of 166 countries, and that's how the WTO functions, by the consensus of 166. Well, if many of them want to move forward on any of these issues I've just named, they could do it, and they have informally, but it's not recognized in the WTO. They should invest in strategic foresight. Maroš Šefčovič, the new trade minister of the EU, his prior role in the last commission was in part to manage strategic foresight. What's that mean? It means what most businesses do: look ahead and see what challenges exist. What's the next thing they have to deal with? WTO doesn't do this. It had a trial of it at a staff level that the members didn't particularly welcome. They need it. Um, so, and they need a budget that is freed from use of the purse, the power of the purse, to direct the agenda. Uh, those who would do this now are the United States and India. When I say this, hijack the whole organization, hold it hostage by holding up the budget, because again, unanimity is needed, according to the way things have worked out. In other words, no one objects, and these are two countries that do object. So a crisis is an opportunity to make some things better. A crisis needs a response as well. And what I propose is that the members say, well, here's a list of things that we're going to do vis-a-vis each other. And if the United States isn't ready or doesn't want to participate, that's okay. That doesn't mean we can't move ahead and decide how we will treat each other. How we will treat the United States depends very much, it's a bilateral issue at this point. There's not going to be an immediate agreement on how to deal with the United States, because countries say, well, maybe we can do some things that you want. Maybe we can deal with immigration. Maybe we can deal with fentanyl if you're Canada and Mexico. Um, the Trump administration is very transactional oriented. The president, I should say, really is oriented in that direction. So there won't be a global response to the United States at present, but there'll be individual responses. If the president decided that uh, Kenya or Uganda or someplace was a particular priority, if he saw it that way. Could be South Africa. Uh, the president doesn't like some of the rulings of the ruling party in South Africa, and he could say, well, you change that and I can do this for you in trade, or I will, if you don't, I can do that to you in trade. So there's going to be a lot of bilateral deals. I think that's unavoidable. But can South Africa agree that with respect to the EU and Japan and the rest of the world, that it's going to behave in a certain fashion, and in return for all of the others behaving in that way with respect to them? Yeah, sure. Yeah, is that going to happen? Not yet. It's not. It may take a while before the members discover that the United States, accounts for in the single digits in world exports compared with the rest of the world. Um, uh, so it's not the dominant country that it was in 1948. It is still a very important country, but it is uh, uh, we're in a situation where the rest of the world is not used to um, making decisions absent the United States in trade. Uh, this you could see this. In the first Trump administration, I was over in Geneva as a deputy director general. Uh, there was an inadequate response on the part of others, to the fact that the United States was sitting on its hands. It said a few things about things it didn't like. It made no proposals to speak of, and it didn't work them. There was a proposal on subsidies, but it didn't work at it. Um, the same was true in the Biden administration. The United States was AWOL, absent without leave, and it sat there, it won the chair, but was no longer exercising leadership. And the European Union, much like what is happening in geopolitics, the European was not used to acting without the United States, and neither was Japan, neither were the Commonwealth countries, for example, um, and that's not good enough. Uh, if uh, if world trade is to continue to be an engine of economic growth and stability in the world, then uh, the rest of the world, the 165, other than the United States, has to wake up, smell the coffee, and find a way forward. And it's just not happening yet. But I wouldn't rule out that it would. So happy to discuss other issues or these issues, hear your questions, and go from there.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. I think you're describing a very tenuous and uncertain world at the moment. And one of the major questions that I think we're all grappling with is, what is the end goal for the Trump administration in imposing all these tariffs? They cite many different reasons for imposing tariffs, such as raising revenue, such as rebalancing the trading system, such as making forcing companies to manufacture more in the United States, addressing unfair trading practices, using tariffs as a tool to address other policy objectives. But what's the end state that they're seeking? Is it a fortress America, or is it something else?
It is what the president believes it should be on any given morning or afternoon, for that matter. So, should Canada become the 51st state? Should Greenland be part of the United States? Should the Panama Canal be transferred back to the United States? You've listed most of the alternatives, and probably none of us can come up with what all of them will be. It is what of the moment, apparently, the United States is most interested in. The U.S. has proposed no system. It's not said this is a terrible agreement, the WTO. Trump did say that in the first Trump administration. He has not said that again. He's not said let's replace it. There is no proposal on the table. Will there be at some point? We don't know, because you cannot predict. I mean, part of Trump's strength in negotiating terms is creating uncertainty, and the trading system is the whole idea behind the trading system is creating certainty. So he certainly wouldn't necessarily um, foreclose the use of his various authorities and freedoms. Um, we can guess. Um, would he change? No basis for thinking that, but that's always possible.
Yeah, I can't imagine he's going to change, especially since he ran on tariffs in his campaign, and he firmly believes in them over the decades. So this is even though we're only like 8 weeks in, not even, I think, it feels like we've got this is going to be the pace and the cadence for the rest of the administration. Um, I I've heard that there are some Trump affiliated groups who want to create a new trading system outside the WTO that would, and Ambassador Lighthizer, the former USTR, in his book has also tried to articulate this, that you need a system that where trading balance is the end goal. It's like you have to have total balance of imports and exports. There can't be any imbalances. Do you think that's even remotely possible? I mean, setting aside the economics.
What you can't, so the one thing you can't set aside is the economics.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
uh, I mean, there are economic realities. It strikes me that there was a piece in Foreign Affairs that came out yesterday from um Doug Irwin and Chad Bone from the Peterson Institute
Mhm.
online. It's very interesting. It says the EU average tariff currently is 5%, and the US tariff is 3.5% on average on industrial goods. Um, well, one could say uh, it probably doesn't matter much, but this is somewhat unfair. So have a negotiation and let's agree to a US EU trade deal where we head towards zero, or we at least head towards the harmonization. We'll go to the same tariff, 2%, whatever it is, or 7%. We want to go up, we'll go up or down, but we'll all have the same tariff. Um, the only way that makes sense is the U.S. believes that on any selective group of items or all items, that it will benefit. And the whole idea of a trade negotiation is it's the same with if you go and buy a car, you say, well, this is what I'm willing to pay and what sort of features will it have. And in a trade negotiation, why is the EU tariff 10% and our tariff is 2.5% on cars? And I would have to say, I was in government, I was a trade negotiator, that the automotive industry in the US, Detroit, big three in those days, didn't come to me or any of my colleagues and say, we desperately want the tariff to go down in the EU, in Europe, on cars. We are competitive. We can sell cars. Our cars will do very well. Never happened. The Detroit didn't come in and ask for that. And if you're a trade negotiator, you actually negotiate for someone who does come in your door and says, I can sell semiconductors or something else. And we're very competitive in whatever, in some product or other. And would you please get the tariff down um, on my product or beef in Japan? If only you could get the Japanese market open up to U.S. beef, we would be um, running to the bank with the profits we make from selling to the Japanese market because our beef is really very popular in Japan. It's not Kobe beef, but not every household can afford a lot of Kobe beef. It's this nice, we have the Great Plains. We have cattle that's raised not just on feedlots, but we have cattle that's raised just grazing out there on the grass. Nature provided us with that. We have an advantage. So you negotiate for what you think you will succeed in doing in terms of your priorities. And that's what we did. Well, where is the demand today for negotiations? It may be from um, uh, high-tech community in terms of um, supplying internet-based services, for example. It could be in insurance. It could be in business services of various sorts. There are a lot of things that we would have as priorities. If you ask the private sector, which you have to do, because government does not know uh, where the most benefit can come from trade negotiations, You ask the private sector, well, what would be very good for our businesses? Where will we succeed? And you go after that. And then you have bargaining, and then there's the reciprocity.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's not taking place.
Yeah, it seems to me anyway, Ellen, that the sheer impossibility of negotiating like one for one reciprocal tariffs on a product by product basis, like going down to the HTS 10 digit level, that I don't think the administration, from a complexity standpoint, is going to go there, but perhaps they're willing to have a tariff column for every single country that has its own individual reciprocal tariff rate that's across the board. I mean, that seems slightly more doable, but we just don't know. And that's the basis for a negotiation, perhaps. But what I think you referred to something early in your previous statement about zero for zero, or dropping down to a level that is um, mutually beneficial. I mean, our my perspective is we tried to do zero for zero tariff elimination agreements in the Doha round, and we made a lot of progress, but the major countries that were blocking it were India and Brazil and the major emerging markets, China even. Do you think it's possible with this new Trump push on reciprocity that we can get back to that kind of thinking?
It would be great if um, Trump creating leverage, creating disturbance in the system, that you end up in someplace better. The only time that tariffs were used broadly by the United States was under Nixon. Uh,
Mhm.
Nixon import surcharge in 1971. Now, his objective was to change the monetary system. The U.S. was running out of gold. It had to devalue its currency, and then 2 years later went to floating exchange rates. The United States was in deep trouble. There's a real problem in 1971. The dollar could not be maintained backed by gold. So there was disruption, a 10% import surcharge across the board, except for duty-free goods. So raw materials were largely exempted. But 4 months later, the U.S. Devalued its currency, closed its gold. The gold window was never reopened. It had been closed in August of 71. Um, Now, here, as you say, um, what would be useful, it seems to me, and I would hope like the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committees should hold hearings and say, well, what are the problems? Where, what, where's the system imbalanced? One of the things Trump has said is, you have, you all have a so-called indirect tax, a value-added tax. It's a tax on goods, not on people. We use a direct tax, tax on people. We use an income tax. That's unfair because, and this is an old argument, uh,
Hmm.
when you export to the United States, you don't bear all of your social costs because you relieve the value added tax at the border, like we in the US relieve the sales tax at the border. But when we sell in Europe, we're picking up some of your social costs. I mean, you live a very good life in Europe. You have good health insurance, you have pensions, you have a lower, apparently, retirement age, such as in France, that they don't want to raise. You're living a very good life, and we're paying for it in part because we pay your value added tax when we try to sell something in Europe. Have a negotiation on it. What should the deal be? Now, the easy answer is U.S. should adopt a value added tax. That
Yes,
would,
that's the easy answer.
yeah, which is, political suicide. So not going to happen immediately anyway, as far as I can see. But is there something there that is worthy of discussion internationally? Sure. And maybe the answer is they tell us adopt a value added tax yourself. Stop complaining. Now, well, you asked about can you get rid of deficits? You can't get rid of the overall deficit in trade unless you change the way you consume things. The United States, both government and private sector, all of us, consume things in vast quantities, and it causes an imbalance in trade. We're great consumers, more than we are investors and producers. Um, so you can't change the overall balance, but you can't as a trade negotiator, can you change some of the incentives to consume at home or abroad? Um, can you strike a better balance? Yeah, you could strike a better balance. Um, you know, I, it, back in dealing with Japan, um, uh, there was a, an, a less of a social safety net, and that's true in China today. There's less of a social safety net, then there's less consumption. And the Chinese are not the world's greatest consumers. They are great producers, but they're not consuming. And they create an imbalance the same way the United States creates an imbalance in the opposite extreme. And if you make adjustments in the degree of consumption um, and investment, uh, you can get to a better balance in the world. But that's not what on offer at present.
Mhm. Well, before I turn it open to the floor for questions, one other point I'd like to get your views on is that there are different types of WTO members, as we know. Some of them exceeded into the WTO. Some of them came into the WTO because they were GATT contracting parties. And of those GATT contracting parties, some of them never made big commitments to open up their markets during the various rounds of GATT negotiations. So I'm thinking of like the large emerging markets like India and Brazil, Pakistan, Nigeria. I mean, it's a big list of big emerging markets that are going to be the growth markets of the future. So if you look at their tariff schedules, a lot of their tariffs are still unbound. And many of the tariffs that are bound have very high bound rates, which means that they can impose tariffs legally in the WTO at a very high level without violating their WTO commitments. That's always been, I think, a goal for the United States as a former negotiator. Like we focused on trying to reduce that water between the bound and the applied rates, but we got tremendous resistance from those markets. Is this an opportunity to address that kind of imbalance in a way to open up those big emerging markets to US exports? Because that seems to me to be a problem as well.
Yeah, I'd say you're exactly right. That even China's tariff schedule is not to the extreme of India because there
Hmm.
wasn't on China coming into the WTO in 2001 where China took on enormous level of change in obligations. Not enough, but a lot. And India has not. So you're quite right. And Trump is creating leverage. And he'd be the first, if he was sitting here on this call, he would say, that's what I'm doing. I'm creating leverage. You tell me where there's unfairness, because I've asked all of my agencies that are engaged in trade in any way by April 1st to give me a report on the unfairness in the world trading system, which I will remedy. Um, uh, what's missing from the discussion of to date is what should the U.S. objectives be? We're really all worried about the tariff without thinking about the tariffs are coming in some form, way, shape, or manner, and uh, how do you make lemonade out of these lemons? And
Exactly. That is the crux of the issue, Alan. I have been thinking how do you maximize the leverage that Trump is generating to address systemic problems? I'm not convinced that Trump actually and his team really know how to use that leverage appropriately. But that's a different conversation. But I think one of the ways they could is just to get India and South Africa and others to stop blocking progress at the WTO. Like if you're just confining this to a WTO conversation. But I digress. I'd like to open up the floor to questions, knowing that we have a few minutes left.
Alan, I have one. Could this fragmentation of this global trade system lead to the more powerful regional trading blocks, whether they be the RCEPs or the Mercosurs or others in other parts of the world, and potentially even lead to, China leading a block of its own, which currently through RCEP, and then the fragmentation leads to more empowerment, which perhaps currently in its current guise, they're not given, and BRICS as well is the other, obviously. And all these changes could lend these regional trading blocks more power.
I think that is one real possibility that the RCEP, CPTPP, even the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there'll be those who are looking for opportunities as to how do we manage our international trade and in a positive sense, the system, what's trading system to look like, and there'll be a lot of effort to with frustration in the WTO because of India and sometimes South Africa blocking uh, global agreement. Well, let's see what we can do on a regional basis. There are limits to that, though. The EU, when the idea which Ed mentioned of coalitions of the willing, let's all band together and have a better system that applies to just some of us, has its limits. Um, the, um, the EU is not going to bind itself to be totally open to China, for example. So um, and progress on a regional basis is not possible on things like global food security, on agricultural subsidies. So you don't have all the players in the room, the necessary players in the room, or dealing with the next pandemic. You could have an RCEP agreement on they won't restrict uh, say vaccines among themselves when another pandemic comes along. But what if the vaccine is made in the United States or is made in Europe, not made in an RCEP country? So something that you can have some trading block improvements, but I think regionalism has its limits.
Yeah, Dan, my sense is that even if the United States decides they don't want to participate in globalization anymore, in a political economy sense, the rest of the world still, especially developing countries, will still want to globalize because it's in their benefit to integrate into the overall system. That's not going to change. They're not going to the United States' actions are not going to dissuade developing countries and emerging markets from trying to develop further and become developed countries. And they
Yeah,
have to do
also,
that through integration.
yeah, a lot of trade is increasingly going to be north-south. So in services, business services, it's useful to be in the same time zone, and a growth of services north-south, uh, business services. So back offices might be in Africa for Europe, and they might be more in Latin America for the United States. Um, So the direction of trade is and this is true for actually fruits and vegetables too. Easy to get fruits and vegetables north south than it is to go um, around the world east west. So there's a natural wish to find markets where um, economics tells you can make some real successes. And that's not just as confining yourself to RCEP or CPTPP or the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or any other regional agreement.
Right. I think Dr. Shanine has a question. Anders, you want to read that out?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I- yeah,
I can read it, Anders.
Sure, go ahead.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Wolf, for sharing your insight. Do you think we Canadians are at risk to being taken over as the 51st state? And should we continue with our retaliatory tariffs? Thank you, Shanine.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of resistance. The United States has upended, for example, the upcoming election, um, and both within the Liberal Party and nationally so far, just changed the circumstance. So the direction of sentiment doesn't appear. I'm not seeing any study that shows any poll that shows uh, even a small minority Canadian view of joining the United States, and they may have something to say about that prospect.
So might the King of England. Canada is still part of the Commonwealth, of course, but King Charles may have an opinion. Any other questions?
yeah. But just before, I think the second part of the question Shanine had is, should Canada
Oh,
continue
yes.
retaliatory tariffs? Maybe we want to address that as well.
Uh, it decided in the case of the broad Canadian tariff that it had to be rather careful with the United States. I know the broad Canadian tariff, I'm talking about the 25% across the board tariff that Trump initially put on and walked back from. It didn't work out perfectly for uh, using electricity exports as a means for putting pressure on the United States. On the other hand, Canada acted as countries do with respect to steel and aluminum. So it seems to work better on a more limited. Um, it's a little bit like the geopolitical situation around the world. The major countries of the great powers of the world have decided not to have a war with each other since 1945. Um, they have had a lot of there've been a lot of uh, proxy wars, limited wars. So Afghanistan and actions in Syria and Ukraine, but not all out war. Um, Canada and the United States would have to think carefully about uh, whether they can tolerate limited actions like steel and aluminum retaliation versus a flat across the board action. Um, and I'm sure that's a topic of discussion in Ottawa. Um, Maybe not in Washington, but certainly in Ottawa. They're thinking about what do we do with respect to our neighbor. Um, and but there has been um, a return to Washington of we're going to live up to um, the USMCA. It's sort of interesting. I mean, that's clearly a decision taken by the White House as well as in Ottawa that better to live with the MCA than an all-out war. The U.S. Canadian Ottawa Agreement was put into effect in 1965. It's been a long time of integration of our auto industry, and it turns out, as President Trump said, that would cause great harm to the auto industry to disrupt that trade. It would really hurt U.S. companies, and as well as U.S. employment. So limited war seems to be more acceptable than all-out war. So some rationality in this world still, as of March 13.
And Alan, I thought what was most interesting from this week is that the Premier of Ontario, Mr. Ford, agreed after the tit for tat the other day on electricity and the US ratcheting the tariff up to 50% for Canada. Mr. Ford and Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, agreed to start talking about USMCA renegotiation, right? So the tariffs were supposed to be about fentanyl and immigration to an extent, but the end result is that they're going to talk about USMCA renegotiation, which we thought was always going to be the case, that these tariffs would be eventually transitioned into leverage on USMCA. And if that's the frame, then you have a different set of objectives, like convincing Canada to take additional steps to contain China, for example, or to limit the import of Chinese content into North America. And they're eventually going to have that conversation with Mexico as well. And I think the Mexicans are playing their cards a bit better than the Canadians at the moment.
It is an interesting direction, and it's difficult to apply trade sanctions to political goals, just as cross-sectoral retaliation, like retaliation against intellectual property for a trade in goods problem, cross retaliation is hard to limit, and it does threaten the trading system.
Well, I think, Anders, how much more time do we have left? We're past 10 o'clock.
Yes, I technically set aside for an hour and a half, so it's up to us. I suggest that if we have time, if we have a few more questions, we could go on for a few more minutes, if everybody's okay. I have one or two questions myself. I don't know how many other questions we have.
Well, Anders, I suggest you fire away then.
Yeah. Yeah, so my question, first question goes back a little bit back to the origin of this webcast, which is this code of conduct, this World Trading System code of conduct. And my question is, I mean, it is pretty apparent, Alan, from your great piece that this code of conduct is not necessarily the WTO action itself. This is a broader effort that goes, but my question is, how do we conceive of all of these potential reforms, and how do we formalize these actions? I mean, on the one hand, there are specific things that you're talking about in here that clearly are about WTO reform. I mean, we're talking about getting around the limitation of how to proceed with plurilateral agreements, for example, which, basically you need full consensus to move ahead with these, on whether it's fisheries or investment, or whether it is, electronic commerce. And you mentioned things like the Secretary General, enabling her to actually perform more of a CEO and setting agenda and so forth. So that would obviously require actions within the WTO. So I just like to get your view on these many great suggestions. How would we think about formalizing it? How do we actually put some of these to life? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the progress is going to be through pragmatism. The GATT was a very pragmatic organization from its inception from the late 1940s through 1995. Um, the GATT Secretariat was not the GATT itself, which you looked at a building on Rue de Lausanne in Geneva, which it had since the 1970s, and you say, well, the GATT must exist. Well, no, it didn't exist. It was the interim committee to the International Trade Organization, the ITO, which never came into being. So the GATT had no legal existence for 50 years, and that was all right because countries decided they would just deal with it as if it were uh, a legal organization under the UN system, or that it had a treaty basis. And it didn't have a treaty basis. Um, well, if let's say the chairman of uh, uh, the General Council uh, said to the Indian delegation, if you decide you're going to block the investment facilitation for development, this really small agreement that developing countries really like, and a lot of them want, just facilitating investment through various means. It's not about market access. It's about how you'll deal with investment. Publish things in your national on website. Make it easier for if you turn down an investment, you'll tell the investor why you're turning down the investment. Just procedural stuff, due process. Um, if the chairman of the General Council, a very brave person, said, if you raise your flag, which is how you get recognized, you raise your name card in the WTO, in the General Council meeting, I'm going to ask you why you're against this agreement. And if you say, I don't, you, the Indian ambassador, say, I don't have to answer your question. I say, oh, you're not recognized. So we have approval to go ahead. And we just went ahead.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, well, you can't add this to the WTO rule book because it's not formally agreed by all of us. You say, oh, well, all of you the rest of you agree that it is part of the WTO and it's not applicable to you, India. You say you're opting out. That's great. That's okay. And you're meeting next Tuesday in room D in the Centre William Rapart, the headquarters of the WTO. There's a new agreement, and in our annual report, we will, the Director General will talk about this activity on investment, the way you talk about other activities in the WTO. And India, we don't care what you think. They say, oh, you can't do that. You say, yeah, I just did it. So I'm in the Just Do It school. Uh, uh, and you can do it to the United States too. And they did. They found a way to have a dispute settlement system without the United States. Those who wanted to, they just did it. And they found a way under the rules and you can't find that easily with respect to everything. But, you know, what exactly is the limitation on well, what it is why do all countries want to keep consensus? They just want to convince the India and South Africa to be reasonable, and they just want to say, just shut up when we put something forward, and just sit down or after you object, but you do not object formally, and you allow it to go forward. That's what the easy solution is. But the Indians say, we're not doing that. So you say, actually, we're ignoring you. It's doable. I mean, why do you allow yourself to be held hostage? Oh, and as I say, the reason is everybody really wants their veto. It's as if you're on a train and you have an emergency brake at every seat, and one passenger actually keeps pulling the emergency brake so the train doesn't move anywhere. And the rest of the members are very upset about it, but they don't do anything about it. You say, actually, we're disabling your emergency brake at your seat. All want to keep it. That's why it's there. They all want a veto. And they don't want to vote because what in the world would happen in a vote? You say, well, there's a block of countries, maybe the developing countries, that are the majority. They put through anything they want. And what they would want would be unilateral concessions from developed countries, potentially, because they would say, we didn't get reciprocity in the Uruguay round. You developed countries killed they would say, the Doha development agenda, the Doha negotiations. Now, so we're reestablishing the Doha negotiations, and we're dictating the result, and we're doing it all by voting. And it wouldn't have a lot of meaning in that you can't bind countries to any outcome that they haven't agreed to, but you could have um, a lot of pro-development uh, by vote rules added to the rule book. It's just it wouldn't apply to those who opted out, so it wouldn't be very meaningful. Anyway, but no one wants to go to voting. No one wants to go to get rid of the rule by consensus. They just want India to be more reasonable. India doesn't want to be more reasonable because they're taking the every agreement as a hostage for whatever it is they feel is important at the time. But anyway, I'm in the just do it school.
I'm in the Just Do It school too. I think it's high time that we roll over these blockages. But you know, I think there's a real risk that coalitions of the willing are going to try to take these initiatives outside the boundaries of the WTO entirely. And there is, precedent for this. It started outside the WTO. It was sort of the negotiations were happening inside the WTO. It was the trade and services agreement negotiations because I think there were issues that were under negotiation that might have been a little bit outside of the framework of the WTO, but the countries, including the United States, that wanted to take this forward knew that they were probably going to come up against resistance from countries like India. So the WTO will become even less relevant so long as India and South Africa continue to block progress.
Yeah, so if I might just ask a follow-up question, and this is very interesting. So my takeaway from this, if I understand it correctly, is that the way the General Services Council meeting and so the General Council meetings and so on can be run, you can actually, without any formal reform, just by using procedural methods, you can actually circumvent some of these stalling tactics from some of these countries, and you could potentially make a breakthrough on these plurilateral agreements and so on. If that is very, I think to me, very promising if that's the case. But then I have another question, and that is this code of conduct. I know that with which we are looking at seeing how we as tech associations around the world can do our part and to push for a trading system that lowers barriers or at least prevents the worst possible aspects of the emerging trade wars that we are seeing. And let's say if WITSA was to be advocating for a type of code of conduct, would we want to advocate for the WTO to formally adopt a set of conducts, or are we thinking about a more informal, loose set of actions that we would work, that each tech association would work with their respective governments to implement, internally? Are we looking at a more is the best way forward for tech associations and which to at the end of the day see a code of conduct that would be a formalized action within the WTO, or are we looking at something more formal ad hoc here?
I think that you go for the maximum, which is a formal agreement uh, among. This is going to be among the willing. First of all, there'll be a number of countries that say, we don't know what this means, we don't know how it'll affect us, and we're not ready to act. With 166 countries, or members, really, because the EU is one member as well as 27. Um, uh, they will operate at different speeds, and the WTO should be and was and it's become rigid. It's ossified. Uh, it was always a coalition of the willing operation in the GATT years, uh, not until the Uruguay round when there was a single undertaking. There was less participation than there were members of GATT, called contracting parties, but members of GATT. Um, and could they do something formal? Yeah, they could do so. I think optimally they would do something formal and binding among themselves. And that should be pushed for. And you can always fall back to um, softer language. Trade negotiators are used to softening language and building in ambiguity as to what's binding. So there's scope for uh, getting something less, but I think to coalesce around something, you say, okay, here's a code of behavior, and it will be modified. So the EU, the example cited earlier, if the EU goes to 2.5% on automobiles from the United States, it really doesn't want to go to 2.5% on automobiles from everyone else. And that's WTO inconsistent. It's violation of most favored nation. So it has to either be in violation or figure out how it's going to deal with the rest of the world in an equitable manner. It may say, well, we can get by this by having stiff countervailing duties against China, and they're the major producer. But what happens if Turkey gets a lot of investment from around the world, and China included, to make EVs, and countervail isn't enough. So it's this code of conduct will not be an easy sell to in a binding fashion, um, but it's worth the debate, and it's worth to make it as much as binding as it can be. Some things can be done. The Just strengthening the secretariat. Um, uh, and one of the things I suggest is that the World Trade Organization be a World Trade Organization, namely, it would administer CPTPP and RCEP and the regional. You say you have disputes, bring them here. We have expertise on settling disputes. Um, will any regional organization that wants to have it administered from um, Geneva will do that. Um uh, make the WTO a hub of knowledge. That can be done by without changing the rules. When I say a hub of knowledge, you want to know what's going on in agriculture. You don't uh, create a new FAO, Food and Agricultural Agreement, in Geneva, but you tap into the FAO and you say um, that expertise is available to all WTO members through the WTO's Knowledge Hub, so online. There's a lot can be done, and there's an opportunity in a crisis to say, well, can we do things better than we're doing them at the WTO? Of course we can, including those who want to agree to something. They're going to agree to it, and they're going to meet at the WTO, and they're going to act every bit as much as if it were a WTO agreement formally attached in the right place in the Articles of Agreement of the WTO.
I appreciate that. Thank you. There are no more questions for me. Thank you so much, Alan. Ed, any other questions?
I mean, I always have questions, but the one other option that I think for trade wonks we've discussed is um, renegotiating the balance of concessions for individual countries in the WTO. So I think this is a hard nut to crack when it comes to the violation of the MFN principle. So with your example, would it even be possible for the United States, Europe to drop its light vehicle tariff from 10 down to 2.5% just for the United States, and then rebalance concessions for the rest of the world if they don't want to provide that same tariff rate for everybody else?
Especially since there's probably, I don't know the exact figures by any means, but there's probably not that much automotive trade from other than China coming along. But even China would be early days. Based on a historical level of trade, probably not a lot of vehicles coming in to the EU.
Maybe Korea and Japan, but because US or EU Korea agreement might have given the Koreans a little bit more market access.
Right. But yeah, that's a possibility. Pay elsewhere. I think, the Europe, Brussels, EU will strain to um, make things as close to the current WTO rule book as possible. And that means paying compensation
Yeah.
for a violation. And this would be a violation.
So what kind of compensation would they pay? Like reducing a tariff in another area?
Could be. In these days, of course, getting investment is also balances things out.
So if you
Not
can,
in not in a WTO sense, but in a political sense.
in a political economy sense, yeah. But if you wanted to do it in a WTO sense, it would have to be a concession that you would then formalize and bind.
And there may not be enough trading stock to do that.
So it gets
So Ed,
messy.
so Ed, on the concessions area that you were mentioning, for that to actually be considered, that would have to be done through the WTO mechanisms, right? There would have to be a form. Probably the U.S. would have to make a formal request for a launch of negotiations then within WTO. Am I reading that correct?
Um,
Well,
no,
the Article 28 route would be um, uh, wouldn't really be Article 28. It would be this would be a flat out violation, and there'd be a case brought by ostensibly by Japan and Korea and China, all bring a case in the WTO against the EU, unilaterally lowering its tariff only to the United States. The panel finds that the EU is in violation, and the EU has to ante up uh, something to make it right, or to suffer retaliation.
Mm.
So the negotiation comes after dispute settlement, which can be a time-consuming process. You know, and I don't know that Japan and Korea want to retaliate against the EU. Um, uh, it would probably all be short-circuited in some sort of negotiation that's not usual.
Well, the better route would be for the EU to offer that 2.5% to United States, Korea, and Japan, and then they in concert put up more barriers against imports of autos from China.
Uh, except China would have a case.
Yeah,
Wouldn't be part of the deal.
it would not be part of the deal. Yeah.
I have a
And
question.
you see,
Sorry, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask given the current dynamics, what kind of mix do you see of between economists and lawyers going forward, even within the trade environment and negotiations, punitive measures, or agreements that are broken, violations that happen? Do you see lawyers coming in and making a meal out of this?
Now, the lawyers in Brussels, not the private sector lawyers, but the lawyers of the European Commission and the European Commission are going to strive to keep the current world trading system, which is a rules-based system. Rules-based system means you have to have lawyers. You go away from rules-based system, you don't need lawyers at all. I'd probably get rid of economists too, and just have political figures who say, this is what I can live with. Do the following. Um, and That's a whole different world. So what I wrote was, can the 165 who are not the United States retain a world trading system among themselves that is as close as possible to the existing world trading system, modified to improve it? I mean, there are problems with the existing world trading system at the WTO. Um, and I think they should strive to do so, and it should be an acknowledged formal effort. You sit down with as many countries as you can and say, in Geneva, what are we going to have? And the United States, well, I don't think this conversation should take place. You say, I'm sorry, it is taking place. Um, you can't stop. The one thing in the rule book is to launch a negotiation, you do not have to have consensus. You can launch a negotiation in the WTO on anything, and they have, like on investment facilitation for development or e-commerce or um, small and medium businesses negotiations. They've done it. So you launch a negotiation and you make it as formal as possible, um, as opposed to right now. You talked earlier about fragmentation, total fragmentation. I mean, there are those who think there's still a system, and others who are beginning to question whether that system after April 1st or 2nd, is there still a system, or is everyone going their own way? And for a while, the system will be um, uh, lived up to a fair degree, and then it will be subject to a lot of pressures. And how do you resist those pressures? By having some agreement as to how you'll behave. And that's not happening currently. Maybe it will happen after April 2nd. It's not happening now.
Yeah,
Except formally there's some discussions, but very limited.
I tend to think that there's going to be some actors within the WTO confines that are going to take advantage of this new world that the United States is creating, where they're also in a position to exercise their political and economic heft and might. I'm thinking of India in particular, but we'll have to see how that plays out over the course of time.
Indeed.
Well, Anders, I think we've hit our mark here at 10:30.
Now, Stan Allen, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion, and really appreciate your time and insights. I think we in WITSA will, and everybody will have to consider, how we can best help to preserve the multilateral trading environment as best we can. And your thoughts on this, I think, are very, very helpful. So again, I appreciate you very much.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Alan,
Alan.
Ed, everybody for being here. Thank you again.
You're
Bye.
welcome. Bye.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Anders.
Thanks,
Great to see
everybody.
everyone.
See you.
Yeah.